The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Mitchell as the military helicopter touched down on the landing pad. Dust swirled in the air, and several officers stood waiting at a respectful distance. This wasn't just any homecoming, this was the return of Delta Squad from their deployment in Syria. And everyone knew they'd been through hell. Captain Rebecca Martinez stood among the waiting crowd, her jaw tight as she watched the helicopter's blades slow to a stop. She'd been expecting this moment for weeks, but not for the reasons others might think. While her fellow officers saw this as a celebration, Rebecca knew the truth about what had really happened overseas. She knew about the lies, and the man who'd tried to destroy her career. One by one, the soldiers stepped off the helicopter. First came Sergeant Mike Davidson, his chest puffed out as he waved to the small crowd that had gathered. His perfectly pressed uniform and confident stride made him look every inch the war hero the media had painted him to be. Behind him came 3 other members of Delta Squad, all men, all walking with the swagger of those who believed their own hype. "There's our hero," whispered Lieutenant Colonel James Harper to the officer beside him, nodding toward Davidson, the man who saved his entire squad when they were pinned down behind enemy lines. Rebecca's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She wanted to speak up, to tell them the real story, but she'd learned the hard way that in this man's army, sometimes the truth wasn't what people wanted to hear. Especially when that truth came from a woman who'd been labeled a troublemaker. The crowd began to disperse as the 4 men were escorted toward the debriefing room. Media photographers snapped pictures of Davidson, who had somehow managed to emerge from a war zone looking like he'd stepped off a recruiting poster. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his uniform immaculate, and his smile broad and confident. But Rebecca remained where she was, her eyes fixed on the helicopter. Something was wrong. The squad was supposed to have 5 members, not 4. She'd studied the deployment records carefully, had memorized every name on that list. "Where's Private Jackson?" She called out to no one in particular. Davidson stopped walking and turned around slowly. His smile faded when he saw Rebecca, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. "Private Jackson didn't make it, Captain," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Took shrapnel from an IED. We tried to save her, but... He shrugged and shook his head sadly. Rebecca stepped forward. She'd known Private Jessica Jackson was part of the squad, but hearing Davidson refer to her in the past tense sent a chill down her spine. "What exactly happened to Private Jackson?" "Like I said, Captain, she didn't make it." Davidson's voice carried a warning tone. "Maybe you should focus on welcoming home the soldiers who did survive instead of dwelling on those we couldn't save." Several officers nodded in agreement, but Rebecca wasn't finished. She'd done her homework on Private Jessica Jackson. The young woman had been one of the most promising soldiers in her unit before the deployment, smart, brave, and completely dedicated to her service. She'd also been the one to file a formal complaint against Davidson for inappropriate conduct. Just weeks before they'd shipped out, that complaint had mysteriously disappeared from the files. "I'd like to see the incident report," Rebecca said firmly. Davidson's jaw tightened. "I'm sure that's above your pay grade, Captain. Besides, some of us have been fighting a real war while others have been sitting safely behind desks." The insult hit its mark, and Rebecca felt her cheeks burn. It was true that she'd been stateside during Delta Squad's deployment, but only because she'd been reassigned at the last minute, an assignment that had come right after she'd started asking questions about Davidson's conduct with female soldiers. Under his command, "That's enough. Both of you," Lieutenant Colonel Harper intervened. "Sergeant Davidson, report to debriefing room 3. Captain Martinez, I need to see you in my office." As the crowd began to break up, Rebecca took one last look at the helicopter. The crew chief was still inside, moving around the cargo area with unusual care. She started to walk toward the aircraft, but Harper's voice stopped her. "Captain Martinez, my office now." Reluctantly, Rebecca turned away from the helicopter and followed Harper toward the administration building, but as they walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that something important was still on that aircraft. Something Davidson and his squad didn't want anyone to see behind them. The helicopter crew continued their work in silence, handling their cargo with the kind of reverence usually reserved for fallen heroes, and in the growing shadows of the late morning sun, a figure emerged from the back of the aircraft, someone who'd been waiting, listening, and preparing for the right moment to reveal the truth. The last passenger was about to step off the helicopter, and when she did, everything would change. Rebecca sat in Lieutenant Colonel Harper's office, her back straight and her hands folded in her lap. Harper was a fair man, but he was also a pragmatist who understood the politics of military life better than most. She could see him weighing his words carefully as he looked through the file on his desk. "Captain Martinez," he began slowly, "I know you've had some concerns about Sergeant Davidson's leadership methods. Sir, with respect, my concerns go beyond his leadership methods." Rebecca leaned forward slightly. "Private Jackson filed a formal harassment complaint against him. That complaint disappeared from the system 3 days before deployment. Then, coincidentally, I was reassigned from Delta Squad at the last minute." Harper sighed and closed the file. "The harassment complaint was investigated and found to be unsubstantiated. As for your reassignment, that came from higher up the chain of command. Sometimes these decisions are made for reasons we don't fully understand at our level. And now Private Jackson is conveniently dead," Rebecca said bluntly. The words hung in the air between them like an accusation. Harper's expression hardened, and for a moment, Rebecca thought she might have pushed too far. "That's a serious allegation, Captain. Do you have evidence to support it?" Before Rebecca could answer, there was a knock on the office door at Harper's. Secretary peeked in, looking unusually flustered. "Sir, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's something happening at the helicopter pad that you need to see." Harper frowned. "What kind of something?" "It's hard to explain, sir. Maybe you should just come look." Harper and Rebecca exchanged glances before rising from their chairs. They followed the secretary outside and toward the landing pad, where a crowd was beginning to gather once again, but this crowd was different from the earlier one, quieter, more subdued, with people pointing and whispering among themselves. As they got closer, Rebecca could see why. A figure was emerging from the back of the helicopter, moving slowly and carefully. Even from a distance, Rebecca could see it was a woman in military fatigues. But something was wrong with the way she was walking. Her movements were stiff and labored, as if every step caused her pain. "Is that ... double quotes," Harper began, then stopped. "Private Jackson," Rebecca whispered. But as the figure came closer, Rebecca realized it wasn't just Private Jackson walking toward them. She was carrying something, or rather, someone. In her arms was a small child, maybe 3 or 4 years old, with dark hair and wide frightened eyes. The crowd fell silent as Private Jackson approached. Her uniform was torn and dirty, and Rebecca could see fresh bandages on her arms and neck. Her left leg dragged slightly with each step, suggesting an injury that hadn't fully healed. But her eyes burned with a fierce determination that made everyone around her take a step back. "My God," Harper breathed. "Jackson, what happened to you? We were told you were KIA." Private Jackson stopped about 10 feet away from the crowd. She looked directly at Harper, then her gaze moved to Rebecca, and finally settled on Sergeant Davidson, who had pushed his way to the front of the crowd. The color had drained from Davidson's face, and his confident swagger was nowhere to be seen. "Permission to speak freely," Sir Jackson said, her voice hoarse but clear. Harper nodded, seemingly unable to find his voice. "I was left for dead in a building collapse during our mission," Jackson began. Her voice grew stronger with each word. "Sergeant Davidson ordered the squad to fall back while I was still inside, searching for civilians. When the building came down, he reported me as Kier without sending a search and rescue team." A murmur went through the crowd, but Jackson wasn't finished. "I survived the collapse with a broken leg and multiple lacerations. I managed to dig myself out after 6 hours, only to find that my squad had abandoned the position." She adjusted her grip on the child, who had buried his face against her shoulder. "That's when I found him." "Who is he?" Harper asked gently. "His name is David. His parents were killed in the same bombing that brought down the building. He was trapped under debris for almost 2 days before I found him." Jackson's voice broke slightly, but she continued. "I spent 3 weeks getting him to safety, carrying him across 40 miles of hostile territory with no backup, no supplies, and no communication." The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone was staring at Davidson now, whose face had gone from pale to ashen. "That's not how it happened," Davidson stammered. "We had to fall back. We were taking heavy fire. There was no choice." "There's always a choice," Jackson replied quietly. "You chose to leave me behind because you knew I was going to report what you did to Corporal Williams back at base camp." Rebecca felt her heart skip a beat. Corporal Williams had been another female soldier who'd made complaints about Davidson. She'd been transferred to a different unit shortly after. "You're delusional from your injuries," Davidson said, his voice rising. "You don't know what you're talking about." But Jackson smiled grimly and reached into her pocket with her free hand. She pulled out a small digital recorder and held it up for everyone to see. "I've been recording everything since I found this in the rubble," she said. including the radio conversations where you told command that I was confirmed KIA without ever sending anyone to look for me. The crowd erupted in angry whispers. Harper stepped forward, his face grave. Private Jackson, I think we need to get you and the child to the medical facility immediately. Then we need to have a very long conversation about what happened over there. As the crowd began to disperse, Rebecca found herself walking alongside Jackson toward the medical building. The child, David, had fallen asleep in Jackson's arms, his small face peaceful despite everything he'd been through. How did you know to record everything? Rebecca asked quietly. Jackson looked at her, with tired eyes. Captain Martinez, after my harassment complaint disappeared and you got reassigned, I knew I was in trouble. I started documenting everything as soon as we deployed. She paused. I'm just sorry it took me so long to get back and prove what really happened. Rebecca nodded, feeling a mixture of admiration and rage. Here was a soldier who'd literally carried a child to safety across enemy territory while dealing with her own injuries, all while knowing that her own squad leader had left her for dead. But as they reached the medical building, Rebecca couldn't help but wonder what other secrets Davidson and his supporters might be hiding. And more importantly, how far they'd be willing to go to keep those secrets buried. 3 days after Private Jackson's dramatic return, Fort Mitchell was buzzing with rumors and speculation. The official story being circulated was that there had been a miscommunication during the mission, and that Jackson had been separated from her squad during combat operations. But everyone knew there was more to it than that Rebecca had spent those 3 days piecing together testimonies from other soldiers who'd served under Davidson's command. What she found painted a disturbing picture of a man who used his authority to intimidate and harass female soldiers, knowing that the military's good old boys network would protect him. She was reviewing witness statements in her office when her door burst open without a knock. Sergeant Davidson stood in the doorway, his face flushed with anger and something that looked like desperation. You need to back off, Martinez, he said, stepping into the office and closing the door behind him. Whatever game you think you're playing, it ends now. Rebecca set down her papers and looked at him calmly. I'm not playing any games, Sergeant. I'm conducting a thorough investigation into the events that led to Private Jackson being left behind. Left behind? Davidson laughed bitterly. She got separated during combat. These things happen in war zones. The fact that she managed to survive and help some local kid doesn't make her a hero, it makes her lucky. Lucky? Rebecca stood up, her voice rising. She survived a building collapse, spent 3 weeks in enemy territory with a broken leg, and carried a traumatized child to safety. If that's luck, then you have a very strange definition of the word. Davidson moved closer to her desk, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. Listen carefully, Captain. You're already on thin ice around here. People are starting to wonder why you're so interested in defending a soldier who clearly can't follow orders. Maybe they'll start wondering about your own loyalties. The implication was clear, and Rebecca felt her temper flare. But before she could respond, there was another knock on her door. Come in, she called out. Never taking her eyes off Davidson. The door opened to reveal Private Jackson herself, walking with a slight limp but looking much better than she had 3 days ago. She was accompanied by Colonel Patricia Hayes, the Basis Inspector General who Rebecca had requested to oversee the investigation. Sergeant Davidson, Colonel Hayes said coolly, how convenient, we were just looking for you. Davidson's confident demeanor cracked slightly. Ma'am, I was just discussing the situation with Captain Martinez. I'm sure you were. Hayes stepped into the office, her presence commanding immediate respect. She was a woman in her 50s who'd earned her rank through 3 decades of exemplary service, and she had a reputation for being absolutely ruthless when it came to rooting out corruption and misconduct. Private Jackson has provided us with some very interesting evidence, Hayes continued, including audio recordings of radio communications during your mission. Davidson's face went pale again. Those recordings could have been doctored. She was injured, traumatized. She might not even remember things correctly. That's possible, Hayes agreed, which is why we've also spoken with Staff Sergeant Miller from the communications unit who monitored your squad's radio traffic during the mission. Rebecca watched as Davidson's confidence completely evaporated. Staff Sergeant Miller was known for his meticulous record-keeping and his absolute integrity. Miller confirmed that you reported Private Jackson as KIA approximately 30 minutes after the building collapse, without attempting any search and rescue operations, Hayes continued. He also confirmed that you denied Jackson's requests for backup when she tried to establish communication from the collapsed building. We were under fire, Davidson stammered. I had to make a tactical decision to protect the rest of my squad. And yet, Jackson spoke for the first time, her voice quiet but steady. You had time to search the building for intelligence files before reporting me dead. All eyes turned to her. She was holding another small device. This one looked like a compact video camera. I found this in the rubble, she explained. It belonged to one of the civilians who was killed in the bombing. It was still recording when you and Corporal Williams entered the building 20 minutes after the collapse. She handed the camera to Colonel Hayes, who examined it carefully. The audio is clear enough to hear your conversation with Corporal Williams, Jackson continued, looking directly at Davidson, including the part where you said, and I quote, "Let the bitch rot. This will teach other women to keep their mouths shut." The silence in the room was deafening. Davidson opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, apparently realizing that anything he said would only make things worse. Colonel Hayes tucked the camera into her jacket pocket. "Sergeant Davidson, you are hereby relieved of duty pending a full investigation into charges of dereliction of duty, endangerment of personnel, and conduct unbecoming a non-commissioned officer. You will surrender your weapons and report to the stockade within the hour." "This is insane," Davidson protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "You're taking the word of a mentally unstable soldier over a decorated combat veteran." "No," Hayes replied firmly. "I'm following the evidence wherever it leads, and right now it's leading to a court-martial." As military police officers arrived to escort Davidson away, Rebecca felt a mixture of relief and satisfaction. But she also knew that this was just the beginning. Men like Davidson didn't operate in a vacuum. They needed support from higher up the chain of command to get away with their behavior for so long. After Davidson was led away, Hayes turned to Jackson and Rebecca. "Private Jackson, I want you to know that your courage in coming forward has probably prevented other soldiers from suffering the same treatment," she said. "Your actions overseas and your willingness to tell the truth here at home reflect the highest traditions of military service." Jackson nodded, but Rebecca could see the exhaustion in her eyes. "What about David, ma'am, the boy I brought back?" "He's in protective custody while we work with international agencies to find relatives or arrange proper placement," Hayes replied gently. "Thanks to you, he's safe and receiving excellent care." As Colonel Hayes left to continue her investigation, Rebecca found herself alone with Jackson. "How are you holding up?" Rebecca asked. Jackson was quiet for a long moment. "I keep thinking about all the women who tried to speak up before me, the ones whose complaints disappeared, who got transferred or pushed out of the service." She looked at Rebecca. "How many others are out there afraid to come forward because they've seen what happens to those who do?" It was a question Rebecca had been asking herself for years, but now, for the first time, she felt like they might actually be able to do something about it. "That's going to change," Rebecca said firmly, "starting now." 2 weeks after Dick's arrest, the investigation had expanded far beyond anyone's initial expectations. Colonel Hayes had uncovered a network of misconduct that reached into multiple units across the base, involving not just Davidson but several other officers and at least 2 commissioned officers who had helped cover up complaints and retaliate against accusers. Rebecca found herself at the center of the investigation, having been appointed as Hayes's liaison for gathering testimony from affected personnel. It was difficult work. Many soldiers were reluctant to come forward, having seen what happened to those who tried to report misconduct in the past. She was in the middle of interviewing another witness when her phone rang. The caller ID showed Lieutenant Colonel Harper's number. "Captain Martinez, I need you in my office immediately." Harper's voice was tense. When Rebecca arrived at Harper's office, he found him pacing behind his desk, his usually calm demeanor replaced by obvious agitation. "Sit down, Captain," he said, without looking at her. "We need to talk." Rebecca took a seat, wondering what new development had shaken Harper so badly. "I've just gotten off the phone with General Morrison at Division," Harper began. "He's concerned about the scope of this investigation." "Concerned how, sir?" Harper finally looked at her, and she could see the conflict in his eyes. "He feels that the investigation is becoming a distraction from the base's primary mission. He's worried about media attention, congressional inquiries, that sort of thing." Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine. "Are you saying he wants us to limit the investigation?" "I'm saying he wants it concluded quickly and quietly," Harper replied carefully. "Davidson will face court-martial for his actions overseas. Should be sufficient to demonstrate that the Army takes these matters seriously." "What about all the other victims? What about the officers who helped cover this up?" Harper sat down heavily in his chair. "Captain, sometimes we have to choose our battles. We can't fight every injustice, especially when doing so might harm the larger institution we've sworn to serve. Rebecca stared at him in disbelief. Sir, with respect, these women served that same institution. They trusted it to protect them, and it failed them. How is covering that up serving anyone? Before Harper could respond, there was a sharp knock on his door. Without waiting for permission, Colonel Hayes entered, followed by Private Jackson, and to military police officers. Lieutenant Colonel Harper, Hayes said formally, I have a warrant to search your office and seize any files related to personnel complaints filed within the last 3 years. Harper stood up abruptly. Colonel, what is the meaning of this? Hayes handed him a document. We have evidence that suggests certain personnel files were altered or destroyed to protect officers from misconduct allegations. Your signature appears on several transfer orders that removed complaining soldiers from their units immediately after filing reports. Rebecca watched as Harper's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, anger, and finally, resignation. I was following orders from division, he said quietly. Whose orders specifically? Hayes asked. Harper looked at Rebecca, then at Jackson, then back at Hayes. For a moment, Rebecca thought he might refuse to answer. Then his shoulders sagged. General Morrison, he said that too many complaints were affecting unit morale and readiness. He wanted the problem soldiers transferred out before they could cause more disruption. Problem soldiers, Jackson repeated, her voice flat. Is that what you called us? Harper looked at her with what might have been shame. Private Jackson, I want you to know that I never agreed with those characterizations, but I had my orders. You had a choice, Jackson replied. Just like Sergeant Davidson had a choice. Just like everyone who participated in this cover-up had a choice. Hayes nodded to the military police, who began systematically searching Harper's filing cabinets and computer. Within minutes they had uncovered a cache of documents that had been hidden away: original complaint forms, transfer orders, and correspondence with division headquarters detailing strategies for managing sexual harassment allegations. Lieutenant Colonel Harper Hayes said formally, you are hereby relieved of command pending investigation into charges of obstruction of justice and conspiracy to violate the rights of military personnel. As Harper was led away, Rebecca felt a mixture of vindication and sadness. He hadn't been evil like Davidson, just weak and willing to follow orders even when those orders were wrong. Captain Martinez, Hayes said after Harper was gone, I'm placing you in temporary command of this unit until a replacement can be assigned. Rebecca nodded, still processing everything that had happened. What about General Morrison? That's being handled at levels well above both of us, Hayes replied. But I can tell you that congressional investigators are now involved, and several journalists have started asking questions. Jackson stepped forward. Captain, there's something else you should know. When I was overseas, I wasn't the only woman in Delta Squad. Rebecca frowned. The roster only showed you. That's because Corporal Williams was transferred to another unit the day before deployment. Officially, she was needed elsewhere. Unofficially, Davison had her removed because she'd filed a complaint against him. Where is she now? Jackson's expression darkened. She was killed in action 2 weeks ago, serving with her new unit in Afghanistan. A unit that was specifically requested by Davidson to take soldiers who were causing problems. The implication hit Rebecca like a physical blow. Not only had Davidson and his conspirators been covering up sexual harassment, they'd been using transfers to dangerous assignments as punishment for women who complained. How many others? Rebecca asked quietly. We're still investigating, Hayes replied. But preliminary evidence suggests this pattern has been going on for at least 5 years, involving dozens of soldiers across multiple bases. Rebecca looked at Jackson, seeing in her eyes the same determination that had carried her 40 miles through enemy territory with a wounded child in her arms. What do we do now? Rebecca asked. Jackson's answer was simple. We make sure this never happens again. 6 months later, Rebecca stood before a packed congressional hearing room, preparing to give testimony that would be broadcast live on national television. The hearing was the culmination of the largest investigation into military sexual harassment and cover-ups in decades, sparked by Private Jackson's courage in coming forward and the evidence she'd gathered. At the witness table beside her sat Jackson herself, now promoted to sergeant and serving as a liaison between Congress and the military's new oversight committee. The young boy, David, had been reunited with relatives in Jordan, but not before Jackson had ensured he received proper medical care and counseling for his trauma. Across the room, Rebecca could see familiar faces, some supportive, others hostile. The scandal had divided the military community, with some viewing the investigation as necessary reform, and others seeing it as an attack on military tradition and morale. Sergeant Jackson, the committee chairman, began. Would you please tell the committee about the culture of retaliation you encountered when you tried to report sexual harassment? Jackson leaned toward the microphone, her voice clear and steady. Senator, the retaliation wasn't subtle. When I filed my complaint against Sergeant Davidson, I was immediately labeled as a troublemaker. I was given the worst duty assignments, excluded from training opportunities, and made to feel like I was the problem rather than the victim. And when you were deployed overseas, I believe I was deliberately placed in dangerous situations as punishment for speaking up. The mission where I was left for dead was supposed to be a routine reconnaissance, but we were sent into a known hostile area with insufficient backup and outdated intelligence. Rebecca watched as several committee members exchanged concerned glances. The evidence they'd uncovered showed that this wasn't an isolated incident. Women who complained about harassment were routinely assigned to the most dangerous missions, often with reduced support and resources. Captain Martinez, another senator, addressed Rebecca. You've been investigating this network of misconduct for months. In your professional opinion, how widespread was this problem? Rebecca had prepared for this question, but it still made her stomach turn to think about the scope of what they'd discovered. Senate or investigation identified at least 47 cases across 12 military installations where female soldiers who filed harassment complaints were subsequently transferred to combat zones or higher-risk assignments. Of those 47 women, 11 were killed in action and 16 were wounded seriously enough to require medical discharge. A murmur went through the hearing room. Those weren't just statistics, they were women who'd served their country and paid the ultimate price for refusing to stay silent about abuse. And what happened to the officers who orchestrated this retaliation? Sergeant Davidson was court-martialed and sentenced to 15 years in military prison for endangerment of personnel, dereliction of duty, and conspiracy. Lieutenant Colonel Harper received a dishonorable discharge and is facing federal charges for obstruction of justice. Rebecca paused, knowing that the next part of her testimony would be the most important. General Morrison was forced to retire early, but he has not faced criminal charges. Several other officers involved in the cover-up received letters of reprimand, but remain in service. Is that justice, in your opinion? Rebecca glanced at Jackson before answering. No, Senator, it's not. Real justice would mean that every officer who participated in this conspiracy would face appropriate consequences. More importantly, it would mean systemic changes to prevent this from happening again. The hearing continued for several more hours, with testimony from other victims and expert witnesses, but the moment that would be replayed on news broadcasts for weeks to come happened when Jackson was asked about her time carrying David across enemy territory. Sergeant Jackson, many people have called you a hero for saving that child's life. How do you respond to that? Jackson was quiet for a long moment, and Rebecca could see her struggling with emotion. Senator, I'm not a hero. I'm a soldier who did her job. The real heroism would have been if the system had protected all of us. The women who tried to report harassment, the soldiers who were punished for speaking truth, and yes, even David and his family who got caught in a war zone. She paused, looking directly into the television cameras. I carried David to safety because it was the right thing to do. But I shouldn't have been in that situation to begin with. I was left for dead because I refused to be silent about abuse. That's not heroism, that's survival. The hearing room fell completely silent. I hope that my experience, and the experiences of all the women who testified here, will prevent other soldiers from having to make the same choice between their safety and their integrity. As the hearing concluded, Rebecca found herself surrounded by reporters and advocates who wanted to know what came next. The investigation had led to congressional legislation mandating independent oversight of harassment complaints and severe penalties for retaliation. Several military academies had revised their training programs to address toxic leadership and the treatment of women in combat roles. But perhaps most importantly, Jackson's story had inspired dozens of other women to come forward with their own experiences, creating a movement that was transforming military culture from the bottom up. Later that evening, Rebecca and Jackson sat in a quiet bar near Capitol Hill, finally able to speak freely after months of investigations, hearings, and media attention. Do you think it was worth it? Rebecca asked. Everything you went through, everything you had to sacrifice. Jackson took a sip of her drink and considered the question. I think about David sometimes, how scared he was when I found him, how he trusted me to carry him to safety. That's what we did for all those women who couldn't speak for themselves. We carried them to safety." She looked at Rebecca with a slight smile. "Besides, someone once told me that there's always a choice. I chose to fight back." Rebecca raised her glass, 2 choices, and to the courage to make the right ones. As they sat there, 2 soldiers who had refused to accept injustice and had fought to change a system that had failed so many, Rebecca couldn't help but think about all the young women who would serve in the military in the years to come. Because of Jackson's courage and sacrifice, they would serve in an institution that was safer, more just, and more worthy of their dedication. The helicopter that had brought Jackson home had carried more than just a wounded soldier and a traumatized child. It had carried the truth, and sometimes, that's the most powerful weapon of all.